The air inside the courtroom was so heavy it could almost be touched. Every creak of a chair, every shuffle of paper, echoed like a drumbeat in the silence. Then came the sharp crack of wood against wood. Judge Aileen Cannon's gavel slammed down with a force that rattled even the microphones on the desk. Her voice followed, stern, clipped, and dripping with authority. "Enough! You will stop speaking now." The command sliced through the room like a blade. Eyes turned instantly toward the woman who had been interrupted, Representative Jasmine Crockett. She had been mid-sentence, her words weaving a case that blended fact, law, and moral urgency. But now, before she could finish, the judge's order sought to erase her voice from the air itself. The courtroom bristled with unease. Some leaned back, uncomfortable, while others leaned forward, eager to see what would happen. Cannon's gaze was unflinching, daring Crockett to retreat, to fold, to bow before the weight of the bench. For a moment, it seemed like the kind of silencing that had happened too many times before, authority pressing down on truth, power smothering voice. But Crockett did not look away. She lifted her chin, eyes locking with Cannon, steady as stone. There was no flinch, no apology, no hesitation. Instead, there was something else. An energy, quiet but electric, like a storm gathering behind her calm. The very air seemed to shift, as though everyone in the chamber sensed that what came next would not be routine procedure, but history written in real time. The seconds stretched, taut as a wire. Cannon expected compliance. She had used this tone before on others who swallowed their words, lowered their heads, and let silence swallow the truth. But this time, across from her, was someone different. Crockett's presence radiated defiance without a single spoken word, her silence more powerful than Cannon's demand. A whisper rippled through the gallery. Reporters shifted their pens, cameras tilted ever so slightly closer, ready to capture the moment. Cannon's jaw tightened. The power dynamics of the courtroom teetered on a knife's edge, and everyone knew it. And then, with nothing more than her steady gaze, Crockett made clear. She would not be silenced. But what Crockett said next didn't just defy Cannon. It left the courtroom frozen in disbelief. Moments like this are never just about the four walls of a courtroom. They echo outward, becoming symbols of who gets to speak and who is forced into silence. Judge Aileen Cannon's gavel may have been aimed at one woman in that instant, but the crack of it resonated like an attempt to quiet a much larger story. The story of dissent, truth, and accountability standing up to raw power. To understand the electricity in that room, you have to know who Cannon is. Her name has long hovered in controversy, attached to rulings that critics say bend the scales of justice toward privilege and protection of the powerful. She carries herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, her words treated less like law and more like decree. Her courtroom has too often been a stage where fairness seemed secondary to control, and her gavel, a weapon used not only to maintain order but to establish dominance. And then there was Jasmine Crockett, sitting at the opposite end of that tension. Crockett is not a stranger to confrontation. She has built her career on being fearless with the truth, even when speaking it came with backlash. For years, she has walked into spaces where voices like hers were meant to be small, meant to be background noise, and she has refused to shrink. That history gave her presence in Cannon's courtroom a deeper meaning. She was not just another voice being silenced. She was carrying the weight of every time someone had been told to sit down, shut up, and know their place. The collision between these two figures was more than personal. It was archetypal. On one side, the embodiment of institutional power, armored in robes and ritual. On the other, the embodiment of resistance, armed only with conviction and the truth. The stakes were clear. If Cannon succeeded in silencing Crockett, it would not only be one woman muted. It would symbolize the triumph of arrogance over accountability, the mooting of courage by fear. And yet, if Crockett found a way to push back, if she managed to stand tall even against the authority of the bench, then the ripple effects could not be contained by marble walls or wooden gavels. That defiance would spread outward, into headlines, into communities, into the veins of a country already questioning who gets to speak in America and who gets silenced. The air that day felt charged with that very possibility. You could almost hear it in the hushed murmurs of the gallery, see it in the flicker of cameras capturing every twitch of Cannon's expression, every deliberate breath Crockett took before her reply. Each second stretched, the balance of power dangling precariously between suppression and defiance. And this was the brilliance of the moment. Cannon thought she had tightened the reins, that she had closed the door on Crockett's argument. But in reality, she had set the stage for something far bigger, because Crockett's strength was never in avoiding conflict. It was in walking straight through it, refusing to bow. And just when it seemed Cannon had the upper hand, Crockett revealed why she could never be silenced. Judge Aileen Cannon did not step into the courtroom as a blank slate. She entered already cloaked in controversy, her name whispered in political circles with both suspicion and admiration, depending on which side of the aisle you listened to. To her defenders, she is a symbol of steadfast loyalty. To her critics, she is the very portrait of bias disguised as justice. And on this day, that reputation walked in before she even opened her mouth. From the very beginning of her tenure, Cannon has been a lightning rod. Her rulings have sparked outrage, often reading less like the blind balance of law and more like the weighted thumb of preference pressed hard against the scale. Again and again, observers have accused her of favoring the powerful, bending rules for those who already have too much, and shutting down voices that dare question authority. To Cannon, her courtroom is not a place for debate. It is a stage where she alone decides the script. There is an arrogance in the way she commands the bench. It shows in the clipped tone of her orders, the dismissive wave of her hand when objections rise, the pointed way she reminds everyone who holds the gavel. She does not merely maintain order, she revels in control, ensuring that all eyes remember who has the power to speak and who does not. Some might call it discipline, others call it something else entirely, the misuse of authority for spectacle. And yet, Cannon carries herself with the quiet certainty that her decisions are untouchable. Wrapped in the robe of judicial immunity, she seems to believe her words are beyond reproach, her actions unassailable. The irony, of course, is that the more she insists on silence, the louder her critics grow. Each time she interrupts, each time she bends a ruling in ways that feel suspect, she leaves a trail of doubt in her wake. Observers recall past cases where her decisions drew headlines for their leniency toward those in positions of privilege. Commentators dissected her language, highlighting passages that seemed less about justice and more about protection. Patterns emerged. The powerful were cushioned, the critics cut short, the underdog reminded of their place. It was a reputation built not on impartiality, but on selective authority. And so, when she tried to silence Jasmine Crockett in mid-sentence, it wasn't just one more command in one more courtroom. It was part of a larger pattern, a habit of shutting down inconvenient voices before they could fully speak. To Cannon, it was routine. To everyone else watching, it was the same arrogance they had seen before, distilled into one decisive moment. But arrogance is a dangerous currency. It spends quickly, and it blinds those who carry it. Cannon may have thought her gavel gave her absolute control, but control built on intimidation is fragile. The more it is wielded, the more it exposes its own weakness. And in this particular courtroom, her weakness was about to be revealed in front of the very audience she wanted to dominate. Because across from her sat someone who was not intimidated, someone who understood that Cannon's authority, while intimidating, was not invincible. For all the weight of her robe, for all the years of her rulings, Cannon had never faced a voice quite like Jasmine Crockett. In Cannon's world, power flowed from the bench downward, unquestioned, unchallenged. But in this case, she was about to discover that real authority does not come from a gavel or a robe. It comes from truth, conviction, and the courage to speak even when silence is demanded. And that was the irony she never saw coming. Cannon believed she could win with the force of command. What she didn't understand was that sometimes the greatest strength in a courtroom isn't the loudest voice. It's the one that refuses to be muted. But what Cannon didn't expect was that across from her stood someone forged by struggle, armed with a story that could not be silenced. Before Jasmine Crockett locked eyes with Judge Aileen Cannon in that tense courtroom, she had already spent a lifetime learning how to stand tall when others tried to push her down. Her story wasn't written in polished halls of privilege or cushioned by connections. It was forged in the raw, unyielding crucible of struggle, where dignity had to be fought for every step of the way. From a young age, Crockett understood that silence was never an option. Growing up, she watched people in her community brushed aside, their voices drowned out in systems designed to favor the powerful. She carried those images with her, the working families scraping by, the neighbors whose grievances were dismissed, the people whose truths never made it past the gatekeepers of authority. It was in that environment that her grit took root. Every time she saw someone ignored, she felt the fire to speak louder, to push harder, to demand what others were told they didn't deserve. That fire carried her into law school, where she quickly discovered that the very institutions promising justice often worked hardest to preserve inequality. While others pursued comfortable careers that guaranteed prestige, Crockett chose the path of resistance. She became a public defender, standing beside those society had abandoned, people who didn't have money for a polished defense, who were treated as case numbers instead of human beings. It was gritty, thankless work, the kind that kept her up late and weighed heavy on her spirit. But it also gave her something more valuable than prestige. It gave her the armor of experience and the unshakable belief that every person, no matter their background, deserves a voice. When she entered politics, that belief only grew stronger. Crockett didn't arrive in Congress on a silver wave of endorsements. She clawed her way forward through skepticism, through dismissal, through those who told her she was too loud, too direct, or too unpolished to last in Washington. But what her critics labeled as flaws, her supporters embraced as authenticity. She wasn't trying to sound like a politician. She sounded like the people she came from. And that was her power. Her identity, black, female, outspoken, unapologetically rooted in her community, wasn't a liability. It was her weapon against the same machinery that had tried to silence so many others. Where others learned to survive by bending, Crockett learned to thrive by standing unbent. And with every speech she delivered, every hearing where she refused to yield, she became a symbol of what resistance looked like when wrapped in both passion and principle. Her colleagues learned quickly. When Jasmine Crockett spoke, she did so with the weight of lived experience behind her. She wasn't parroting talking points or reading off carefully curated notes. She was channeling the raw energy of the people who had been told for centuries that their voices didn't matter. That authenticity made her both admired and feared. Admirers praised her courage. Detractors scrambled to dismiss her, but even their insults carried an undertone of recognition. She was not someone they could easily silence. And that's what made the confrontation with Cannon so symbolic. Crockett had trained her entire life for moments like this, not in some polished debate prep room, but in real battles where the stakes were survival, dignity, and justice. She had already faced systems stacked against her, already walked into rooms where her presence was questioned. What was one more judge with a gavel compared to the weight of all the barriers she had already broken? The truth is, Crockett's resilience came not from avoiding conflict but from embracing it. Every insult, every interruption, every attempt to paint her as too much had only sharpened her resolve. By the time she sat in Cannon's courtroom, she was no longer just Jasmine Crockett, the lawyer, or the Congresswoman. She was Jasmine Crockett, the fighter, the embodiment of every silenced voice that had refused to vanish. Her rise was proof that courage is not about the absence of fear but about facing it head-on, with steady eyes and unwavering conviction. And in that tense chamber, with Cannon's gavel echoing and silence pressing down, she knew exactly who she was. She was the woman who never bowed when told to sit down. She was the one who turned dismissal into determination, suppression into strength. Which is why, when Cannon tried to cut her off, Crockett didn't flinch. She struck back with words that shook the chamber. The silence after Judge Cannon's command lingered like a storm cloud, heavy and unbroken. Crockett's eyes never wavered, but Cannon's gavel had already shifted the mood of the room. The judge leaned forward, her tone sharp and deliberate, reminding the chamber that she and she alone decided who could speak. "This courtroom will maintain order," she declared, her voice taut with authority. Crockett inhaled, steady and unhurried, as if to remind everyone that she would not be rushed into silence. When she opened her mouth again, the words came calm but unwavering, her tone respectful yet resolute. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this matter concerns more than just procedure." A collective breath caught. Cannon's expression hardened. She raised a hand, cutting her off again. "I said enough. You are out of line." The gavel struck once more, reverberating through the room like a shot. Some in the gallery flinched, others leaned forward, unable to look away. The clash between these two women had begun to move beyond legal exchange. It was theater, it was drama, it was a battle of wills unfolding live before witnesses who knew they were seeing history in the making. But Crockett did not yield. She adjusted her posture, shoulders back, chin high, her voice carrying not defiance but an insistence rooted in conviction. "Respectfully, silencing my words does not erase the truth behind them." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scratched furiously at their notepads, the sound of pens scraping paper filling the air like static. Cannon's lips tightened into a thin line. She leaned forward again, each word clipped and cold. "This is my courtroom, not your stage." The weight of those words pressed down on the chamber, and yet, in that moment, it became clearer than ever that this was more than a courtroom. It was indeed a stage. And Cannon had just confirmed the performance for everyone watching. Crockett tilted her head slightly, her expression steady, her tone measured. "A courtroom is not meant to be a stage, Judge. It's meant to be where truth can be heard, even when it's uncomfortable." The room stilled. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if the walls themselves were listening. Cannon's face flushed, a flicker of irritation crossing her composure. She slammed the gavel again, louder this time, the sound booming like a final warning. "You are testing the limits of this court." But Crockett's calm only deepened, her words carrying an almost disarming clarity. "And yet, if truth has limits here, then perhaps it is not justice being served." The gallery gasped audibly this time. Even those trying to remain neutral felt the sting of the remark. It was not shouted, not aggressive, but it cut, sharp and undeniable, like a blade slipped between armor plates. Cannon stiffened, her authority rattled by Crockett's composure. The judge's interruptions had been designed to break rhythm, to dominate the space, to force compliance. But Crockett's refusal to flinch was turning each interruption into proof of her strength. With every exchange, the tension ratcheted higher, the power dynamic shifting ever so slightly away from the bench and toward the Congresswoman who would not be silenced. The courtroom had become a pressure cooker, the air thick with anticipation of what might come next. Cannon's voice grew louder, more insistent, her authority challenged in a way she had not expected. "I will not allow disruptions," she barked, the sharpness of her tone betraying more emotion than control. Crockett leaned forward now, her eyes burning with steady resolve. The room seemed to hold its breath. She was no longer merely responding to a judge's commands. She was about to rewrite the very terms of the exchange. But the breaking point came when Cannon raised her voice, and Crockett unleashed the reply heard around the nation. The sound of Cannon's raised voice still hung in the air, its sharpness cutting through the chamber like shattered glass. For a moment, the silence that followed seemed endless, heavy with tension. All eyes turned toward Jasmine Crockett. She sat there, composed, unshaken, her hands resting lightly on the table before her. She did not rush to fill the silence. Instead, she let it breathe, let it stretch, until the weight of anticipation became almost unbearable. And then, in a voice calm enough to command attention without effort, she spoke. "Judge Cannon," Crockett began, each syllable deliberate, "the law does not belong to the powerful. It does not exist to protect those who already control the room. The law is meant for the people, for every single one of them who cannot be here to speak for themselves." Her words carried no aggression, no raised tone, and yet they struck with the force of thunder. The gallery leaned forward, almost involuntarily caught in the gravitational pull of her conviction. A hush rippled across the space, the kind of silence that doesn't come from fear, but from awe. Cannon blinked, caught off guard by the steadiness of Crockett's voice. She had expected protest, defiance, maybe even anger. Instead, she was met with calm truth delivered like a verdict of its own. Crockett paused, just long enough for the words to sink in before continuing. "You can silence my sentence, but you cannot silence the truth behind it. You can strike my words from this record, but you cannot strike them from the conscience of the people who will hear them, see them, feel them." Gasps erupted from the gallery, whispers swirling like wind through trees. Reporters scribbled furiously, pens scraping in a race to capture what had just been said. Cannon shifted uncomfortably, her jaw tightening, her fingers drumming against the bench. Crockett leaned forward, her eyes never leaving Cannon. Every time a voice like mine is cut short, every time the gavel comes down to remind us who holds power, the world outside these walls hears it, and they ask themselves, if she can be silenced, what chance do we have? The question hung in the air like a challenge, heavy, impossible to ignore. Cannon's face reddened, but she said nothing. Her silence was louder than any objection. Crockett continued, her tone unwavering. "I am here because I was sent to represent those very people. Not the privileged, not the powerful, but the unheard, the overlooked, the ones told time and again that their words do not matter. If I let your gavel stop me, then I fail them, and I will not fail them." For the first time, it was Cannon who appeared on trial. The authority in her robe seemed thinner now, diminished under the weight of Crockett's conviction. The judge's attempts at interruption no longer read as dominance, they looked like desperation. The audience felt the shift, too. You could see it in the eyes of the court staff, in the stiff postures of the attorneys, in the subtle nods exchanged between observers who realized they were witnessing more than a hearing. They were witnessing a reckoning. Crockett let another pause linger, her timing surgical. Then she delivered the blow that sealed the moment. "You may preside over this courtroom, Judge Cannon, but you do not preside over my voice. That belongs to the people who entrusted me with it, and they will hear it with or without your permission." The chamber froze. The line landed like a hammer, reverberating far louder than Cannon's gavel ever had. Even those who tried to remain stone-faced, clerks, bailiffs, seasoned lawyers, couldn't hide their reaction. Eyes widened, mouths parted. A few in the gallery exchanged stunned looks as if silently asking, did she really just say that? Cannon opened her mouth, perhaps to regain control, but no words came. Her authority, so often unquestioned, seemed suddenly fragile, her command visibly shaken. She shifted in her seat, the robe that once draped her like armor now looking more like a costume. And Crockett did not stop there. She drove her point home, every word precise, every sentence building on the last. The history of this country is filled with people who tried to silence voices like mine. They tried in classrooms, in courtrooms, in the halls of Congress. But here we still are, speaking, rising, refusing to vanish. And with every attempt to suppress us, our voices only grow louder. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled, reporters exchanging quick glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Cannon raised her gavel again, but hesitated, as if realizing that another strike would only prove Crockett's point. Crockett held her ground, her voice firm yet steady, her eyes locked on Cannon with the certainty of someone who had nothing left to prove. "So strike my words if you must. Silence me in this room if you feel you have that power. But understand this. The people who sent me here are listening, and they will carry my words farther than any gavel can reach." The silence that followed was absolute, almost reverent. Cannon sat frozen, her lips pressed tight, her authority unraveling not with a shout, but with a calm defiance that could not be broken. For the first time in the exchange, it was the judge, not the Congresswoman, who seemed small, and everyone in the chamber felt it. And while Cannon sat stunned, the real storm began outside those courtroom walls. The courtroom may have fallen silent, but the world outside erupted like a storm. Within minutes, the first shaky phone-recorded clips hit social media. By the time the official footage dropped, hashtags were already climbing at lightning speed. Crockett unstoppable, silence broken, voice of the people. What had begun as a single tense exchange in a Florida courtroom now ignited into a digital wildfire. On TikTok, snippets of Crockett's words were set to music, her line about my voice belonging to the people echoing over swelling orchestral tracks, cut with quick edits of cheering crowds. On Twitter, journalists rushed to post their live reactions. Never seen a judge look so powerless. This wasn't a hearing, it was a reckoning. Threads exploded, dissecting every gesture, every pause, every flicker of Cannon's expression as Crockett dismantled her authority in real time. The viral momentum snowballed. Influencers who normally stayed far from politics joined in, resharing clips with captions like, "This gave me chills," and "She said what we've all been waiting to hear." By nightfall, Crockett's takedown wasn't just news, it was the internet's anthem. Cable networks scrambled to catch up. Panels assembled with urgency, anchors cutting into scheduled programming. Commentators leaned forward, their tones breathless. What we witnessed wasn't just defiance, it was a seismic shift. Conservative outlets fumed, painting Crockett as disrespectful. But their outrage only fanned the flames, making her words spread faster, louder, untouchable. Politicians weighed in next. Progressive leaders tweeted their admiration. Rep. Crockett reminded us why we fight. Younger members of Congress stitched her clip on Instagram Reels, adding captions like, "This is what courage looks like." Even some centrists, usually allergic to controversy, admitted on late-night shows that Cannon looked rattled, while Crockett looked like the embodiment of conviction. And then came the celebrities. A Grammy-winning singer posted Crockett's clip to her 50 million followers with a single word, "Queen." An Oscar-nominated actor added, "This belongs in a movie script, but it's real." Hashtags multiplied as fans across fandoms united in a rare chorus of agreement. It was no longer just politics, it was culture. The sheer velocity of the response was breathtaking. Within hours, Crockett's words had been translated into Spanish, French, Hindi, Arabic. Subtitled versions circulated on WhatsApp, Telegram, and YouTube across continents. From immigrant neighborhoods in Los Angeles to student groups in Lagos, people shared her speech like a rallying cry. Memes flooded Instagram. Cannon's gavel cracking in two, Crockett's calm face superimposed with the words, "You do not preside over my voice." Fan art appeared, turning Crockett into a superhero figure, cape billowing, microphone in hand. On Reddit, users launched entire threads cataloging Cannon's history of questionable rulings, contrasting it with Crockett's viral defense of democracy. Even late-night comedy shows jumped in. A popular host opened his monologue with Crockett's clip, then quipped, "When she said that, Cannon's gavel went from order in the court to Alexa, play sad violin music." The audience roared, but underneath the laughter was an undeniable truth. Crockett had captured the nation's attention. By the next morning, the numbers were staggering. Tens of millions of views. Headlines in every major paper. Editorials framing Crockett as a rising symbol of defiance against institutional arrogance. Hashtags dominating global trends. The digital aftershock was impossible to ignore, proof that Crockett's words had broken through not only the courtroom barrier, but the walls of cynicism that so often mute political moments. And while some warned that viral fame fades fast, this felt different. There was substance beneath the spectacle. Crockett's composure, her precision, her refusal to bend, those weren't just theatrics. They resonated because they embodied something deeper, something people had been longing to see, the courage to stand firm when it mattered most. But beyond the viral headlines, Crockett's words carried a deeper message, one that reached far beyond that courtroom. In the days that followed, the dust of outrage began to settle, but Crockett's words refused to fade. They lingered, replayed not only on screens but in the hearts of those who had heard them. And as the frenzy of headlines and hashtags swirled, something more profound emerged. A lesson, a reminder, a truth bigger than the clash between one congresswoman and one judge. Because what Crockett had done was more than outwit authority in a single moment. She had reframed the entire spectacle. What Cannon intended as silencing became, in Crockett's hands, a declaration of principle. No seat of power, no gavel slammed in anger, no robe draped in formality can strip a person of their dignity, or their right to speak truth. For many it felt personal. Immigrants who had been told to wait their turn, women who had been interrupted in boardrooms, young people dismissed as naive, workers silenced in break rooms, citizens shouted down in town halls. Crockett's words gave all of them a mirror. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending the collective right to be heard, to matter, to exist with pride. And in doing so, she transformed the courtroom into something bigger than marble walls and legal arguments. She turned it into a stage where the old clash between power and principle played out once again. Only this time, dignity stood tall and arrogance stumbled. The moral wasn't buried in legal jargon or abstract theories. It was simple, human, accessible. When someone tries to take your voice, use it louder, clearer, with purpose. When someone demands silence, respond with truth. When authority leans on intimidation, meet it with integrity. That is why Crockett's stand resonated across borders and demographics, because it wasn't only about Cannon. It was about all the Cannons people face in their own lives, bosses, bullies, bureaucrats, systems that thrive on making people feel small. Crockett's defiance became proof that small doesn't mean powerless. That calm conviction can shake even the tallest pillars of authority. And for once, the moral was not cloaked in despair. Too often, politics leaves citizens weary, cynical, convinced that voices don't matter. But Crockett's moment offered the opposite, a spark of hope, a vision of how courage at the right time in the right place can ripple outward until millions feel braver, taller, unafraid. It reminded people that democracy is not abstract. It is alive in every word spoken against injustice. It is nurtured when ordinary individuals refuse to shrink. It survives not in silence but in defiance. That is why people shared her words like scripture, why classrooms discussed them, why community leaders quoted them in town halls. Because Crockett had turned a clash into a lesson, a silencing into a symphony of voices. And so, as the cameras moved on and the headlines shifted, the story still lived on, not because of the gavel that tried to suppress, but because of the voice that refused to bow. Because if one voice can shake the halls of power, imagine what happens when millions refuse to be silenced. Judge Aileen Cannon may have tried to silence Jasmine Crockett, but in doing so, she only amplified her. What was meant to be a dismissal became a declaration, a line in the sand that echoed far beyond the walls of that courtroom. Crockett's courage reminded us that the fight for dignity and democracy doesn't happen only in grand speeches or sweeping laws. Sometimes, it happens in a single moment of refusal. A refusal to bow, a refusal to be muted, a refusal to surrender truth. And that's why this story matters. Because it's not just Jasmine's story, it's ours. Every person who's ever been told to sit down, to be quiet, to wait their turn felt a piece of themselves rise when she spoke. Every viewer who's ever felt powerless saw proof that a steady voice can disrupt even the most rigid structures of power. But here's the thing, her moment doesn't end here. It lives on in us, if we choose to carry it forward. If one voice can shake the halls of power, imagine what happens when millions come together. Imagine what happens when you refuse to be silent in your own corner of the world. So if this story moved you, don't let it stop with you. Share it, talk about it, pass it on. And if you believe in keeping these stories alive, stories where dignity triumphs over arrogance, where courage shatters intimidation, then join this community. Subscribe, stay connected, and be part of the movement that refuses to let justice be silenced. Because this isn't just a video, it's a reminder, and it's a call. The gavel may fall, but the voice of the people will always rise louder.